This is Josh Schlossberg, host of the Green Root podcast, the official podcast of Eco Integrity Alliance, where we're on a quest to uncover the roots of the ecological crisis. For this episode, we have George Wuerthner. George Wuerthner is an ecologist who has been studying wildfire for decades. He has visited many of the larger wildfires that have burned across the West. He has published 38 books, including 2 books on fire issues, Wildfire, A Century of Failed Forest Policy, and Yellowstone, The Fires of Change, plus numerous chapters on wildfire issues in other books, as well as articles and commentaries. George, welcome to the Green Root Podcast.
Glad to be here. So let's get started.
Absolutely. Well, as I was mentioning, this is sort of an emergency podcast, and I figured you're the best guest for this. We want to talk about the California wildfires that are still happening right now, and in fact are flaring up today because of more winds. So let me just pitch you the question in terms of what we hear so far as the conventional wisdom. In what way was land management, or the lack thereof, responsible for these wildfires?
Well, if you're defining land management by what they call active forest management, i.e., thinning of forests, prescribed burning, and so forth, which is the mantra that the agencies, state and federal, put out as a reason for large fires. The assumption is that fire suppression, which I want to get into at some point, has led to high fuel loadings, and then the high fuel loadings are responsible for large fires. A couple of things with that. One, directly related to the LA fires, is most of this is burning through chaparral and grasslands and not forests. And in fact, the majority of fires that cause destruction of homes and structures like that, most of them are in grasslands and that sort of situation. Like the Marshall Fire there in Colorado was a grassland fire. The fires they had in Texas last year, they were grassland fires. The Hawaii fires in Maui were grassland fires, or shrubs. The biggest fires in Oregon this summer were in shrublands like sagebrush and so forth. So this whole idea that if we only did more logging of the forest, we would preclude large fires that are a threat to communities, that is a real exaggeration and not accurate. In terms of the fires that are burning in LA right now, they're mostly burning in chaparral. And chaparral ecology is such that it will disappear if you were to burn it frequently. So one of the arguments they're saying, or some people are saying, if we only did more prescribed burning around there, we wouldn't have these fires. No, what you would have is chaparral would get replaced by grasslands, exotic grasses, which are even more flammable and likely to carry fire and much faster than even the chaparral. So the idea that that we could do more prescribed burning around Southern California and you wouldn't have these fires is just inaccurate. It's not needed, it's not necessary, and it would be doing ecological damage to the chaparral ecosystem, which is a very important ecosystem in itself. So those are sort of the land management issues you frequently hear. The other part of, if you want, you might include under land management is, and this may be a contributing factor, is across the West, we have almost no zoning. And so people are building increasingly in places that are more fire prone and harder to protect. When you build a house way up a canyon, like a lot of the houses in Southern California, it's hard for firefighters to get up in those canyons, with fire trucks. It's hard for people to get out of those canyons, so they're more at risk of being caught by a fire. And the fires spread faster. This is a couple of things about fire. Fire spreads faster uphill than downhill. So if you build your house on top of a ridge top, or partly on the top of a hill, you're more likely to be visited by a fire very rapidly, because what happens is the fire below preheats the fuels above and then causes the ignition. But the real factor leading to the fires in LA, and the most important factor in all large fires, is wind. And wind is not linear in its effect on fire spread, it's exponential. So that when you have a fire that's being fanned by 50 or 60 mile an hour winds, as is occurring even up to 100 miles an hour in some of the Santa Ana winds down there. Um, the way it affects fires is several ways. One, it adds oxygen to the fire, which is an important thing. And people know from campfire stuff, if you got a lot of fuel and it's covering up the fire, you got to blow on it to get it to come to life again. So what these winds do, of course, is it makes anything come to life in terms of a flame. And the second way that it affects, and this is the really key factor, is it blows embers miles ahead of the fire front, which is why all these solutions, prescribed burning, thinning, or whatever, even if it were possible to do in LA, which it's not, but in other communities, they suggest it's possible, they don't work because the wind will blow embers around or through or over any kind of thinning process. And you can see this from fires all around the West. An example would be there was a fire called the Eagle Fire in the Columbia Gorge a number of summers ago in Oregon. And that fire blew embers across the Columbia River where it was 1.5 miles wide and started fires on the Washington side of the gorge. I mean, there's no fuel for 1.5 miles. And there's nothing when they do a prescribed burn where there's no fuel, or where they do thinning, where there's no fuel that wide. Um, and we have many other examples where fires, particularly in Southern California, are going across freeways that have, 10 lanes or something. There's no fuel there. So the idea that fuel is the key to these large fires ignores the effect of wind. And so the wind is the big thing that is behind the LA fires. Now, Santa Ana winds and chaparral have been in Southern California for millions of years. So these things have been happening for a long, long time. And there's really it's not really anybody's fault that they can't put out these fires. What happens is once these are really urban fires that are ignited by a wildfire. And once you get this, a couple of houses going, there's another important point. Houses put out more heat than a regular wildfire. So if they're in any kind of densely situated lot after lot close together, one house ignites, and then within 10 or 15 minutes will often cause the house next to it to ignite, and then that ignites. And then meanwhile, the wind is blowing embers from all these burning houses to the next houses down the block. And so what you have is you might say a perfect situation for fire spread. And the other thing that's really hard for people to understand is that urban fires are burned hotter because of the materials that are in homes. We have a lot of plastic and metals that will melt, and plus wood that's really dried out because you make houses out of kiln dried lumber and so forth. So there's a lot of materials in them that will burn very hot, and they have a lower ignition point. And that gets to another thing. If you look at pictures from down at LA and other fires like this, you'll often see green trees surrounding the lots and where the house is gone right next to it. And part of the reason for that is the trees actually are less flammable in a relative sense than the house because they have moisture in them still. And that helps them resist getting to an ignition point. And the houses, of course, are very dry materials and therefore more likely to ignite. And so you have this situation where you have these high winds that periodically hit Southern California. Now, even though they've been happening for millions of years, one of the things that some studies are showing is that the season when you have those winds is lengthening. And most attribute this to climate change, climate warming. So you have, and climate warming is also affecting things in that we tend to have we're having more severe droughts. Not that we haven't had severe droughts, if you look back over 10,000 years, you've had droughts just as severe, but there's nobody living there to get in the way of the fires. So we have severe drought combined with a longer fire season, and the Santa Ana wind period is also lengthening. So all that does is increase the probability that you're going to have a major fire in this location. And the analogy I would make is it's somewhat like, hurricanes in Florida or even earthquakes in California nobody can stop those natural events from happening. But what you can do is sort of take some precautions to minimize the negative impacts of those. And there are a number of things. One, what we build our houses out of makes a difference. In the old days in Florida, my mom was in Florida still, and like a lot of people's parents. And in the old days in Florida, they built houses out of cinder blocks. And when a hurricane came, maybe they had the roof blow off, but the whole house stood up. Okay. And now today they make it out of wooden walls, and hurricane comes with 150-mile-an-hour winds, and it blows the whole house apart. And in a similar way, the materials we're using to build houses with and could be changed to make them less vulnerable to fires. And that's everything from metal roofs on the top to siding that's made out of, you can get cement siding that looks like natural, wood or stone or whatever. If you have, here's the thing. A wooden wall takes about 20 minutes to heat up to ignition point. But if you had a wall that was made, shielded in metal or shielded in rock or cement or whatever, it's less likely to get to that point. And it's possible that, the fire will move beyond that. So working from the house outward is what you want to do. You want to analyze your house and say, where are my vulnerabilities? And you have to be looking at things maybe a little more critical than you would otherwise. Like, for example, there was a fire in the LA area a couple of years ago where 50 houses burned, not like now, but of the houses that did burn, the majority of them had doggy doors. And the point being is, okay, what's the design of a doggy door? It's made to swing open easily. So when people left their houses, they didn't latch down the doggy doors, and you have a 50-mile-an-hour wind blowing embers at the house, and blows right through the doggy door and into the house. So, things like that. Or I went and visited a house in Montana, which had burned to the ground, and the people had done a pretty good job of making their house fire resistant, but they weren't thinking about, they had these plants out on their porch, that have like fern-like stuff in it, and it was dried out, and an ember got into that, and it was hanging by a rope. So the thing came on fire, the rope burned up, and that fell onto a wooden deck, which then caught on fire and then burned the whole house down. And so you really have to look at things that way. Another thing you can do is have like 5 feet of gravel around the foundation. Because another thing about these fires, a lot of the fires are not flames that directly start on the house. It's like in the grass, and it burns towards the house. And if there's nothing right next to the house for the fire to catch onto, like a pile of wood or a wooden deck, or a fence that's attached to your house, then you're less likely to have the house burned down. So that's, you start with the house and outward. But other things that you need to be thinking about, and it seems like in LA they actually did a pretty good job of this, is evacuations. Getting set up so that you get people out of the way of the fires in advance, and then also makes it easier for firefighters to get at the fires, is an important thing. When the fires hit Paradise, California, a couple of years ago, which 19,000 structures were burned down and 87 people died. Some of the deaths were due to people couldn't get out of town because the traffic was all backed up. They only had a few exit routes, and not everybody keeps their gas tank full. So you run out of gas and you're sitting there and the flames are all around you. You panic, you leave your car, and then you block the exit for everybody else. They can't get out. It's difficult. So planning ahead for things like that is very important. Also planning how to get people alerted. Now, this is another one of those, you can't predict this stuff in advance till it happens. But in Paradise, for example, they had an evacuation process where they were going, people signed up to get notices if they had to evacuate on their cell phones. The thing nobody anticipated is the fire came so fast it knocked out all the cell towers. So people are sitting there in their homes and they can see the smoke coming up, and they're like, well, I guess I don't need to evacuate yet. And so that was another problem. Some of this would be difficult to correct, but it's if you think about it in advance, you might be able to make some changes. For example, I'm living in Bend, Oregon right now, which has 5 or 6 bridges across the Deschutes River, and half of the population is on the west side of town, close to the national forest boundary, which is the direction here that fires are most likely to come from due to prevailing winds, just like the Santa Ana winds. And if you had to get half of Bend's population across all those bridges in an hour, it just wouldn't happen. And in the summertime, which is the time you're most likely to get a fire, up to 20% of the population in Bend is tourists because it's a tourist town. So you have people that don't know their way around the city. In other words, if I came to a bridge and I couldn't get across, I would know someplace else to probably go to hit another bridge. But the average person is not going to know that. Plus, when it's all smoky and you can't even see the sun and you're in panic, I mean, you can just predict what a mess that would be. And as far as I know, the town of Bend has no plan, at least not one that's been presented to the public about, how are we going to evacuate people if we need to quickly. So that's part of, planning. It's just like in Florida with the hurricanes. They have, out in the Keys in particular, which is just a single highway, goes 170 miles or something like that. They've done 2 things that's really interesting. One, they will demand evacuation 24 hours in advance of a hurricane if it looks like it's coming that way, because they want to get everybody out of there as fast as they can. And they don't want the problems of people running out of gas and blocking the one highway off. But the other thing they've done there is they put a limit on new building in the Keys. And the reason is they've said, well, we already have too many people living here, and getting everybody out of here during a hurricane is difficult. So the only way you can build a new building there is if an old one is torn down or maybe destroyed by a hurricane, maybe. But in any event, there's a limit on new construction. And that's kind of thing that maybe places like Southern California need to do in some of these more fire prone areas. Start saying, well, we just can't allow construction in these kind of areas, maybe down in, far away from the edge of the mountains. That's where you're going to build new stuff. And if there isn't room, well, it just doesn't get done. And so those are the kinds of things that could be done in the future for Southern California. But I'm hearing all kinds of things from people saying, oh, well, if, like an example, there's a lot of people trying to blame what's going on there. And one of them is, oh, some of the fire hydrants didn't have water. And some people think that was through neglect or whatever, but it's not through neglect. It happens to be that you don't get a fire where you have, thousands of houses blazing at the same time where you need water for that many places. So you overwhelm the system. And there's probably no way you could build a system reasonably efficiently and cost effective for these kind of events. I mean, these are not they're kind of rare probability that you would have this in any one place, and so how could you anticipate that and efficiently deal with it by, for example, building a more resilient fire hydrant water system? And then the other reason for that was the power companies, which have been taking a lot of heat in California, literally, for the past fires that are started by power lines. So when these fires started, they cut off the power. And in some places, how do you get water to the hydrants? Through pumping, and you need electricity for that. So lack of electricity led to those kinds of things. And then there was some citation or somebody quipping about one of the reservoirs that they had there had been emptied for repairs. And it's like, why did they empty it? It's like, well, who could have anticipated you'd have these fires? You got to repair the reservoir at some point. There is no good time. In fact, in general, the winter is the better time to do it because usually it's wet in Southern California and in the winter. So people are looking for excuses to blame. And of course, the worst one is Donald Trump, who is trying to blame the lack of water on the Sacramento smelt, which is a small fish that lives in the delta up near San Francisco. And it's an endangered species, and so one of the reasons it's declining is a lack of water in the delta. So part of the way to prevent it from going extinct is that they have to have a certain amount of water going there. And I won't go into all the details, but his suggestion is if you didn't have this endangered fish there, then they would have more water in Northern California that they could send down to Southern California to fight the fires. And it's just sort of an absurd thing that makes no sense and is not accurate at all. But of course, Donald Trump accuracy is not part of his main attribute. So, uh, so anyway, the fires are dreadful. I feel sorry for these people that are losing their homes, particularly, a lot of this is just working class people whose, you might say, their entire wealth is tied up in their homes, and if they lose their home, they've lost a lot of what they've tried to save for all their lives. Not to mention, families were started there and so forth. And it's a tragedy. And one of the things that's going to happen for the rest of the West, I think, is we're going to see insurance rise dramatically, probably, unless there's some sort of government solution. I'm not quite sure how you would implement something like that, but it might be just like healthcare, getting healthcare for everybody. If you do that, you can lower the costs for everybody, and there may be a way to do that to lower the costs for everybody in the United States. And we have to realize that because of changing climate, it's just not a California problem. It's not even just a Western problem. Some of the bigger, more deadly fires in our history have been in the East Coast. There was a big fire in Wisconsin in the late 1800s that killed several thousand people. And then you have, there was a fire a couple of years ago right by Great Smokies National Park that Gatlinburg, burned up a whole lot of buildings and so forth. So with changing climate, it's not a guarantee that you won't have fires in other parts of the country. Although the West is definitely the main thing because it's drier to begin with and more susceptible to fires when they happen. And one of the other factors besides the wind, I want to make the point, is drought is another major contributing factor. There's four things that drive big fires, and if you have all four line up at the same time, which doesn't happen very often actually, but if you do, you pretty much have unstoppable fires, and that is major drought, and then high temperatures, low humidity, and then wind. And you put all those together, and if you get an ignition from any source, lightning, could be some arsonist, but sometimes they're just sort of random things. Like there was a big fire in Northern California. The name escapes me right now, near Redding. But it started because a guy was dragging a trailer RV, and he got a flat tire, and he pulled over, and the chain from the connected the safety chain for the pickup truck to the trailer dragged on the ground, and it put out sparks, and that started a fire on the side of the road that spread and burned, I think several 100,000 acres. So how do you prevent that? There's just no way. These kind of random kinds of events, black swan events is what some people call them, are going to occur regardless. And then a lot of the West, particularly the Southwest, has a very high level of lightning. So that's another natural contributing factor. Now, the coast of California doesn't get lightning very often. So most of the fires that are occurring there are due to human ignitions. And some of them it's accidental, like the trailer, but a lot of it is just not thinking, burning brush in your backyard, or just somebody leaving it. The old adage of leaving a campfire, can lead to a fire. So the main thing to take from this, and I want to talk about the drought, is droughts have gotten worse. I'm going to get back to this whole thing about fire suppression. Getting back to this, is that people are saying, well, fire suppression is a lot of fuels to build up, and that's contributing to these large fires. There are several things to look at. One, the whole middle of the last century was actually wetter and cooler than it is now, because the climate change is warming things up. And there were very few fires, and they didn't spread far. And so if it's wet, you don't get ignitions. And then even if you do get ignition, it doesn't burn much. And in fact, glaciers were growing in the Pacific Northwest during that time. And so people that want to say fire suppression was effective point to that time period, basically from the late 1930s through about 1980s, when the Yellowstone fires were sort of the first big one that we had. And that they say, well, we were successful at putting out fires, and that was led to fuel buildup. No, nature was good at putting out fires, and yes, you do have more fuel then, but that was a natural consequence of the weather factors. And prior to that, in the early part of the century, we had huge fires. There was a 1910 burn that burned across northern Idaho and Montana. It burned over 3 to 3.5 million acres. We haven't had a fire that big at all in this later part of the century, early 20th century, 21st century. And we had in some years through the late 20s and early 30s, i.e. Dust Bowl days, we had as much as 50 million acres burning across the West. 50 million acres. Today, if 10 million acres burn in a whole summer, that's considered a record summer. So there's a lack of context in these assertions about fire suppression effectiveness. And but what we have seen is as the climate has warmed, we've been getting droughts that haven't been recorded in 1,000 years. And people are saying, oh, it's all this fuel buildup. And I'm like, do you think maybe 1,000-year drought doesn't have something to do with the fact that we're having bigger fires? You know, the climate influence is totally discounted by a lot of these folks. And so, and due to our continued putting carbon in the atmosphere, we're getting warmer and warmer summers too, besides having drought. So 2024 just came out a couple of days ago, was the driest year globally. I mean, the warmest year globally on record in recent times. Again, you can point to times in the past going back millions of years where it's been warmer, but we didn't have cities built in these places. We didn't have population like we have now. So we're dealing with a situation in terms of the climate change that at least in recent history, the world has not had to deal with. And one consequence is if you have significant drought, then that, along with the lower humidity and higher temperatures, when we're getting higher temperatures, dries out fuel faster, and then you add in wind, and wind is increased by the climate change too, because the wind happens because of differential between high and low air masses, and that's what's driving the Santa Ana winds. It's warmer out there in the desert, and it comes across the mountains, and as it drops down the mountains, it expands and it speeds up and heads out towards the ocean. So as you get the climate change, you accelerate even the occurrence of winds. So unfortunately, I think we are going to see more and more places around the West that are hit by these kinds of fires. Now, the good news is, if you happen to be a homeowner any place in the West, the good news is the probability that a fire will actually hit your home is very low. So I use the example of my mom in Florida. She's lived there 40 years now. There have been a lot of hurricanes in Florida during that 40 years, but she's never had a direct hit where she lives. So the probability there'll be a major hurricane in Florida is very high. The probability that it will hit your home or your town is much lower. So, if you take any solace in that, that is one thing to consider. But that doesn't mean that you shouldn't be prepared and build appropriately. One thing that I have for my house, I purposely bought a house far away from the national forest edge because I was thinking about fire. Most people don't, but I did. But the other, my neighborhood could get wind-blown embers if a fire were to start in town. So I bought rooftop sprinklers. They cost like $100, and 2 of them will cover my whole roof, and you just attach a hose to it, and the last thing I'm going to do if I have to evacuate is turn on the water. Now, a little bit of warning to everybody. The same thing as the fire hydrants in LA. If the power goes off, you may not have water to come out of your sprinklers. But to the degree that you might have water, and different systems are different. In Bend, where I live, the water system is gravity feed. So, I don't know about whether it needs to be pumped right to my house and how the water pressure would change, but you're not going to have zero water pressure. So I'm pretty confident that, if I turn on these sprinklers, wet house won't burn. And so that's cheap insurance to think about. So there are things that people can do that can reduce the chances they'll lose their house. All right, that's a long introduction. You got any specific questions now?
No, that was perfect. This is why I brought you on. You know this stuff backwards and forwards, and yeah, that's a great overview of all this. So I guess a specific question I would have is, with all the information you're providing about it's the wind, and there's a great article you wrote called "It's the Wind, Stupid." That's on
Yeah.
the Wildlife News. Check out that. I'll link that in the description. So wind, we're talking about drought, we're talking about temperatures, humidity, low humidity, all these sorts of things. Yet time and time again, the drumbeat is we got to log the forest. Doesn't matter, or it's in grassland, chaparral, got to log the forest, no matter what happens with a fire. So anytime I see a fire happen, first thing I think is, oh, that's awful. I hope everyone's safe there. My family, immediate family lives right around Southern California area. But then my second is, oh man, this is just going to be, more fuel for the fire for them to just beat that logging drum. So why does it always turn into cut down more forest instead of all the specific things that you explained, some of which are just, well, there's not so much we can do about this other than stopping, all of our carbon emissions, of which logging is a lot of it. We can do zoning issues. We can do things like home hardening, defensible space right around the home. Why do they always go to cutting down the forest?
Well, there's an obvious answer to that, is that they're funded to cut down the forest. And the timber industry has been very good at promoting the concept that it's a fuels issue. And then you can go back to even I went to forestry school a long time ago, but the forestry schools around the West in particular, a lot of them get funded by contributions from the timber industry. Oregon State University in Oregon, for example, where the forestry school is located, gets up to 25% of its funding from some sort of tax on the timber industry, which then goes to fund the school. So if you're a professor in forestry at Oregon State University, you know that it's probably not a good idea to question too much the forestry industry issues because one, if there was less forestry logging going on, they would have less money to begin with, or the timber industry would come down on the department and through the legislature or some other fashion try to reduce the funding for the school. So you have this situation where there's questions that you don't ask, and I don't want to imply that forestry professors are, mislead the public. It's more like, what assumptions do you have? And there's as one professor, I'll tell a story. When I was in wildlife biology at the University of Montana, and one graduate seminar we had was about jobs in wildlife and so forth. And there were 3 wildlife professors there. And finally, after a number of questions, I asked the question, how come, in this school, I recognize in all my classes, nobody questions the ecological effect of hunting? And there is some evidence that, hunting can have, significant impacts on certain species and so forth. And they all kind of looked at each other and kind of smiled a little sheepishly. And finally, one of them spoke up and he said, well, this is the issue. Most of our funding for studies in wildlife comes from the Montana Department of Fish, Wildlife, and Parks, which promotes hunting. And we know that if we start questioning hunting, they're going to cut our funding. And as one of these guys said, and there's all kinds of questions that we can study related to wildlife that, you could say are good questions, like do roads impact, elk distribution or whatever, that are viable studies. And we just are going to study those things because it avoids the controversy. And so that's first thing is people come out of forestry school and then they go to work for the Forest Service or whoever, and they have this whole bias towards you have to protect the trees. And I call it, it's interesting. They say that we're going to fix the forest health and increase resilience. And the whole idea is anything that kills a tree naturally, bark beetles, wildfire, drought, whatever it might be, is a no-no. But it's okay to kill them with chainsaws. I call it chainsaw medicine. Uh, we're going to fix the forest health by cutting it down. And one of the ironies even in that is they never consider all the trees that they've cut as part of the mortality. In other words, there are studies that show that if you add in the trees that were cut during the logging process to, for example, uh, prevent the forest from dying from bark beetles, and then you throw in any mortality that does result from bark beetles, it's usually much higher than if you just had the mortality from bark beetles. And so, and that's the kind of bias that's there in the Forest Service attitudes or assumptions. So the first thing is a fire that kills a lot of trees, which is called a high severity fire, is considered bad. Ecologically, high severity fires create what we call snag forests, which are very important to a lot of species. And I'll just give you one thing. In the Rockies, 45% of the bird species depend on snags at some point in their life cycle. So if you were even able to eliminate snag forests, you'd be harming a lot of species out there. And that's one of the whole things with this whole logging thinning program is it's not benign. You're doing a lot of ecological damage. So that should be weighed. I mean, I might support thinning in a few very strategic locations, particularly right around communities, because there might be a chance that it might give you a little more time for firefighting or whatever. And I'll address that in a second because there's evidence to suggest it might not. But the important point is you have to weigh that against all the damage that's done. The logging roads are a major vector for spread of weeds in the forest. Also, almost all ignitions occur near roads. So the more roads you have, and they're building more and more roads to do this thinning stuff, the more roads you have, the more likelihood you are to have an ignition, which in turn starts the fires that you're trying to prevent. Um, and there are, disturbance of wildlife. A lot of animals are sensitive to being, human entry. There is the loss of carbon that would be stored. Even burnt forests store a lot of carbon because where's most of the carbon in a tree? Well, it's in the trunk and in the roots. And as we know, after even a high severity fire, you have all these standing trees that are storing carbon. As opposed to cutting them down and taking them away from the forest and chopping them up, you're releasing carbon through that whole process. In Oregon, for example, and this shocks a lot of people, the largest single source of carbon in the state is from logging, even more than all the cars and jets and so forth, which emit a lot of greenhouse gases, but logging emits more. And so so that's a problem with this whole solution. You're out there saying we're going to prevent fires by logging, and you were increasing the likelihood of climate warming over time and reducing the amount of carbon that would otherwise be stored in those trees. It's released eventually as the trees rot, but it might take 100 years for a big tree to rot out. And during that time, it's storing all that carbon. So that's a problem. The other thing is people um, don't think about how the either prescribed burn, but I'll talk about the thinning for right now, how that can actually enhance a fire. And both of these things can enhance fire, prescribed burning as well as logging. And the way logging does it is it opens up the forest to more drying. And again, one of the factors that are contribute to fire spread is drought. So you exacerbate the drought in that way. And the other thing is you open it up and wind penetration greatly increases. Again, wind is one of the factors that spreads fires. And in fact, it's a surprising factor is that in a lot of these big fires across the West, the densest forest stands are sometimes the ones that are least affected by a high severity. Fire may go through them, but they're wet. They have a lot of shade. Um, they uh, they have a lot of, even a down log on the forest floor soaks up a lot of moisture and is like a little fire barrier on the forest floor. Um, so so these dense forests that they're trying to eliminate by thinning them and opening them up may actually contribute to more fire spread. And the same with prescribed burning. There's this whole mantra going around. Well, the Indians used to set fires, and that kept fires low. Well, no, it didn't actually. There were big fires the whole time when the Western United States was occupied primarily by, Indian tribes, small populations, because two factors. One, most of the burning that was done was localized. In other words, it did not affect the whole landscape, and reasonably so. If they were doing burning, they're not going to set fires when there's 100-mile-an-hour wind and the conditions where you would get a large fire spread. And we have even evolutionary evidence to support the notion that it wasn't a landscape scale thing. For example, using chaparral in California. Chaparral is the most common plant community in California, more common than any other kind of plant community. And it's vulnerable if you were to burn it frequently, as some suggest we should be doing, every few years. It can't survive. It turns into grasslands. Another example is sagebrush, which is common across the whole Great Basin and a lot of parts of the West. Sagebrush, its typical burn pattern, it burns just like chaparral, but it's not frequent. So it may be hundreds of years between fires in a natural situation. And so if burning by tribal people was common and infected whole landscapes, we wouldn't have sagebrush, and we wouldn't have sage sparrows, and we wouldn't have sage grouse, and so forth. So that's sort of evolutionary evidence that the fires were primarily localized, and that's what the science suggests from some studies. And I could refer to numerous ones, but one, for example, was done in the Willamette Valley, which probably had some of the densest population of native people in the West, because it's a mild climate. There's salmon, there's acorns, there's lots of ways to make a living there. And even there, their conclusion was that the fires that did occur were localized and did not contribute to a larger landscape burn other than would have happened naturally anyway. So anyway, so that's the first thing. And the second thing is, when you do burn, as I suggested with chaparral, but this happens in grasslands and so forth, you actually get regrowth that often is denser and more flammable materials like grasses. And I've seen this repeatedly around where I live in Oregon, where the Forest Service is doing a lot of prescribed burning, but they do it once. And 2 to 3 years later, and I have pictures to show this, there's more grass there now than there was before they did the burn. And that grass is ready to catch a fire and carry a fire. So if you are going to do that kind of thing, you need to do it regularly, pretty frequently, and forever. And the agencies aren't telling people that. They're not saying, well, we're going to do this prescribed burn every 2 years, every 3 years, and we're going to do it in the spring and fall when it's less likely to burn far. And a couple of things about that. Well, because we're going to do it when the vegetation is wetter so it doesn't spread, but you're going to have more smoke because wet vegetation produces a lot more smoke, because mostly what's in smoke is moisture, water. And so you're going to have smoke all spring and all fall, plus any fires that happen in the summertime too. So good luck breathing the air. And the other thing is, we're going to have to do it over and over and over again. Now, I'm not against doing these things if they're very localized on the edge of a town or around, structures and so forth. Because in many cases, it may exacerbate things, but if you do it right, in other words, if you were to burn every year or every 2 years, there isn't going to be much vegetation there. So that obviously could help keep a fire from creeping over to a house or something like that. But you don't need to do it 30 miles from a town, and you don't need to do it once and then forget about it. And that's what I see with Forest Service policy. It's being done frequently like that. And the other thing is, there's impacts just with the prescribed burning too. Just because a plant community is adapted to periodic fire the frequency of fire makes a difference. And so, I'll give you an example. A lot of ground nesting birds nest in the spring, and so if you have a prescribed burn then, and if you did it over large areas, you'd be impacting a lot of nesting birds and other animals. On the other hand, getting back to the high severity fires, there's a lot of interesting things that people are finding out about the value of them. For example, I just read an article this morning about how there was a fire. Research showed that a fire that occurred in the fall stimulated milkweed, which monarch butterflies, as you know, are declining around the West, and that's their main food. So, so the fire is creating more habitat for the monarch butterfly, but it's also, you get more bees, you get more native bees, that is, you get more butterflies after a high severity fire. You have more flowers, usually. That's why you get more bees and so forth. You have more insects in streams because the logs and so forth get in streams, and that provides more food for aquatic insects, which in turn increases the amount of trout or other fish in the stream and the size of them. And it even contributes to, one study was done in the river no return in Idaho, showed there were more bats and birds near those streams because the more insects, if they're insect feeders like bats, they were, colonizing the area around the burn. And of course, he goes all the way up to the larger mammals like elk and deer. A lot of times that stimulates feed that they like, whether it's aspen or willows or whatever. And so in general, you can point to these high severity fires as at least a positive for certain species. Again, it depends on the species, but it's a habitat that is actually functionally rare in the West in general, and it doesn't last that long because within 40 or 50 years, a lot of the snags fall down, and then new growth is coming back, and so those snags are no longer standing. So that affects a whole bunch of species. But then new species depend on the snags on the ground. Like I read one study about mushrooms in Montana that 40% of the mushrooms are found and after high severity fires, both in the soil, but also on the logs that are rotting on the ground. So, the aftermath of these fires goes on and on and on. I have a story to tell. I was hiking in southern Yellowstone Park a number of years ago, and the area I was hiking in had already had forest regrowth, but there were all kinds of logs on the ground. And I figured it probably burned in a high severity fire maybe 60 years before, judging by the size of the trees that had grown back. But every log I passed on the trail had been torn up by bears. And the bears are looking for ants that are in those logs. And I was thinking, who would have thought that a fire, 60 years before was going to create habitat for grizzly bears 60 years later? So that's the way we have to think about this stuff. We have to ask the question. And I find that the agencies are so immersed in this idea that any kind of mortality is bad for the forest. Don't ask those questions. I was on a field trip one time up in Montana with one of these collaboratives, and we're out with the Forest Service folks. And one of the rangers, district ranger, was explaining how they had to log this area because some of the trees had root rot. And so I said to him, so what's the ecological value of root rot, and how does it affect the ecosystem? And he just looked at me like, are you crazy? And I don't have an answer for it, but that's the first response I had, is to ask that question. And that's what we should be doing. Another trip I was on, they were saying how they had to reduce the density. This is in Oregon, of the forest. And, the trees are too dense, and this is bad. Well, then I noted to them, and as a perfect contextual framework, that trees that grow under dense circumstances have a tighter rings. And as a result, one, they're better for lumber. Not that I was pushing that, because they're stronger, but they also are slower to rot, which means that if you see these ecological values to snags and to logs on the ground, trees that grow under a dense condition are going to last longer in the ecosystem before they're fully recycled, and providing whatever benefits those dead trees and down logs provide to the ecosystem. And again, the ranger totally, never even thought about that. And of course, even when I brought it up, they wrote it off as unimportant. But it's an example of how we have, once you get this mindset that any kind of mortality to the forest is bad, then you have a solution, and it's always chainsaws. It seems like. Um, I sometimes, I'm being hyperbolic somewhat, but I'm not inaccurate. I anthropomorphize and say there are a lot of species out there that live in deathly fear of green forests. It's not necessarily obvious. You see all the advertisements, keep the forest green. But if you're a bird that nests in a snag, you don't want a green forest. If you're, bees that depend on logs rotting on the ground for your habitat, you don't want a green forest. There, it's sort of flipping the whole thing on its side, the way we think about these things. But uh, from an ecological point of view, you can make a pretty strong argument that we shouldn't be trying to prevent high severity fires. What we want to prevent is communities burning down and people dying in these fires. And that takes a different approach than trying to uh, prevent the fires from killing the trees in the first place, which, as I've suggested, is largely ineffective. And that's one more thing to mention, is that you can see studies, and I see them all the time, where I'll give you an example. There was a study done in Arizona where the range department showed that grazing would reduce the spread of fires. Of course, the range department, they want to advocate for cows. And they had this whole paper and experimentation. They showed that places that were grazed, fire didn't spread as fast as did non-grazed places. And then at the very end, the next to last paragraph, they put in this one disclaimer. It said, however, under high severity, extreme fire conditions, none of this works. And and this is the thing people have to realize, 99%, 99 point something percent of all fires that occur under climate weather conditions where they don't spread very fast. And it's easy to either put them out or they self put out themselves. There was an example where in Yellowstone, prior to the 88 fires, they allowed 200 and I think it was 235 fires in the backcountry to burn without suppression. And 222 of them only burned like an acre of land. So first of all, most of them are very small. And even the ones that grew a little bigger, all of them went out without any suppression. And that's the situation in most years. So they did this all the way up to 1987. And then in 1988, 1 million acres burned. Well, did they suddenly have more fuel in 1988 than they had in 1987? Why didn't the fires in 1986 or 87 burn 1 million acres? Well, because 1988 was the biggest drought year ever recorded in Yellowstone's history. And the trees, even the live trees, got down to 1% internal moisture content due to the extreme drought. And they had 50 days where they had, 4 days where they had 50-mile-an-hour winds or higher, which spread the fires. So the climate and weather circumstances were entirely different. Again, pointing out that if you have the right conditions, you can get a big fire. So the majority of fires that are studied are under these conditions where they don't spread much. And yes, if it's not really extreme weather conditions, wind, well, maybe thinning the forest might slow down a fire, or prescribed burn might, stop it. But those are the fires that are unimportant, because most of them will go out on their own or they're easy to control. And then you have this really small subset of fires, like what's happening in LA right now, that are burning under these extreme conditions. And they are unstoppable. And people have to realize that when you have those conditions, you're not going to stop the fires. It's like, I'm going to make up a number, which I'm not basing on anything other than just trying to make the point. But 0.1% of the fires that happen every wet in the summer in the West are ones that are problematic in terms of growing large and affecting communities and people, and lots of smoke and all that. But all these solutions that we put out, for the most part, don't work under those conditions. I have gone, like you said in the beginning, I've gone around, made it a point of going around to view big fires, particularly after they burned, to see what circumstances were when they burned. And, I'll give you an example. This is really ironic. I was I was traveling through Northern California when the spring before the Dixie Fire, which in that particular year burned almost 1 million acres. It was the largest fire in California that year. I think it was 2021 or whatever. But it was a drought year, big drought. And I took these pictures of a thinning project where the trees had been thinned and so forth. And then I happened to go back to the exact same spot in the fall after the fire. All the trees had been killed. The thinning made no difference under those extreme conditions. And in fact, some people have plotted out, Brian Baker in particular, who's at Forest Watch in Ventura, California, has been very good about going through the fire history of a lot of these big fires and plotting out where there's been logging or even past fires, and basically showing that it didn't stop these big fires like the Dixie Fire at all. And so we have to realize that this is like the analogy I might make is sort of like the hurricanes. You can have you can fortify your home and so forth to survive a hurricane of a 1 or 2 class hurricane, but a Category 5 hurricane, like a good example would be in Louisiana, where the dikes along the Mississippi broke when the Category 5 hurricane hit. They had plenty of hurricanes before that, and the dikes all held. But when you get the Category 5, it falls. It's the same thing. You could use the earthquakes as an example. You can build buildings that'll survive a earthquake that's maybe 3 or 4 on the Richter scale, but will it survive an earthquake that's 8 or 9? There aren't too many places that are like that. And so what we're seeing, like the LA fires, are like an earthquake that's an 8 or 9 on the Richter scale. And just like you can't predict earthquakes or where hurricanes are going to hit, you can't predict where the fires are going to hit. And you can do as much as you can to fortify your buildings and your surroundings to resist the fire. But at some point, these fires are unstoppable, and you just got to hope and pray that your house isn't in the way. So.
That is such a great summary of all of this. It's a real wealth of information. And I think there's a lack of this sort of information out there. And we're going to do our part to get it out there. And you've been doing this for decades and decades. So I really thank you for all your work over the years and for coming on the podcast. For people who want to find your writing, should they just search your name? What's the best place for that?
Yeah, I publish a lot of things on a thing called the Wildlife News that you mentioned. It's just a website that allows me to put stuff up. I don't run it, but I'm allowed to publish there. And so, yeah, that would be the best way, is to look up my name and Wildlife News, and then you would probably come across. But there are other podcasts and so forth that I've been interviewed for. So maybe put my name in a Google search in Wildfire, probably pull up a lot of different things. And the other thing I like to say as a sort of a closing statement is, all this stuff, assumptions, including my own assumptions, change over time as we learn more about it. So, when I first was writing about wildfires back, decades ago, I was a believer in this fire suppression being the cause of fires, but over time, I changed my mind as I learned more and more about it. So I always try to say, whatever I've said today, 10 years from now, I want to be able to modify it, and don't quote me from something I wrote 10 years ago. Although the general themes, I think, are not going to change that much, but details and new insights will come up, and I'll have to revise what I have to say in light of that. And so just to know that's the way science works, and that's the good thing. As we learn more, we have to revise our assumptions about what is and what doesn't work. I have one more fun story that I like to tell when I give PowerPoints, and I started out with back in the late 1800s, early 1900s. They excuse me. There was an assumption that the size of your skull indicated your intelligence, and so there were a lot of scientists that were measuring people's skulls, And over time, it showed that the average male had a bigger skull than females. So, of course, the conclusion was, well, men are just smarter than women, and it was because the starting assumption that skull size had anything to do with intelligence. So the starting assumption was wrong, and over time we showed that that has nothing to do with intelligence. It wasn't that the scientists that were measuring skulls were measuring incorrectly. So I'm pointing that out. In other words, this is how science changes things. You change your assumptions, and then sometimes you find that the way you've been looking at the problem is biased because the assumptions you start with, and that's certainly been the situation, I think, in a lot of fire policies.
Well, let's hope that the agencies, our elected officials, and all them adapt to the changing times and the science, because they sure as hell have not.
Right. So, well, thank you for having me on.